That was terrific, particularly just from the technical point of view. Having this many people talk about this many projects, showing this many slides, and we're still on time is quite remarkable. Thank you all. So we actually have another 30 minutes to chat, and what we thought was that we would initially do a 15 or 20-minute round table among the participants in the panel, and then another 10 or 15 minutes for Q&A from the audience. So I just have to ask a question that has been on my mind through all of your presentations. Did anybody have, or has anybody had, sort of those moments of insight? You know, maybe when you're alone in the space, or maybe when it's full of people, where there's that sort of spark that jumps, and you think, we're in an old building, and a lot has happened here, and that sense of connecting between what you're doing now and the building, the environment in which you're doing it. Has anybody had that moment?
Well, it's emotional. You know, you're gambling every day when you take on a project with a magnitude like this, and you're kind of living week to week in terms of finances. Everything's emotional. You know, so when you have those exhilarating moments and the place is packed, you know, there were times where I'd be crying. You know, out of being happy and terrified.
I can remember actually working on this building, doing a historic structure report, and I was working with Wes Haynes, a friend and colleague of mine, and it was late autumn, and the light was failing, and we were alone in these houses at the precise spot in front of a fireplace on the second floor, where there was a photograph of FDR getting the election returns from his first presidential election. And the thought occurred to both of us in this little space that he was right there, occupying that precise three-dimensional coordinate. And there was almost this brief sense of the past and the present telescoping, and the distance in time evaporating. I think you've told me that you occasionally sense Mr. Lucas in your work.
Yeah, very spiritual, and the workers refer to the ghost rattling around there as Charlie.
Ghosts?
Every once in a while there'll be just some unexplainable, like there's no wind in the air whatsoever, and the door just slams shut. This happens, but we don't take it seriously. We kind of laugh it off. And in the beginning, it was scary, but I think we're kind of used to it now. Heather, anything in regards to that? I know I like to embellish, but can you verify?
I'll agree. I was walking out of we have just rented not just our building, but now there's 2 gatehouses that lead into the Navy Yard. And as I was walking out yesterday, this thing caught my eye. It was a little postcard on the ground. And I picked it up, and it was an image of the gatehouses, and then I flipped it over and scrawled on the back. It said Thomas Edison arriving in the Brooklyn Navy Yard. And somebody had placed on the doorstep of this gatehouse an image, hoping that we would find it. And then I picked it up and put it in the museum, because that's where those things go.
Where else would it go?
But it was great. It was that kind of thing that you mentioned. Is this a lot? When you're in a city, people feel ownership, especially over these old buildings.
Yeah.
And they want to share in your project, and that's kind of the fun of doing something like this.
When we moved into the Presidio Building, it was hard to see what we were going to find. Diana has sort of X-ray eyes, and she could somehow foresee what we were going to have as working space. the building had so many different uses, as I said, mainly a steam plant, but it had a carpenter shop, it had a locksmith shop, a glazier, and sign painting. I mean, the spaces were all divvied up into these different purposes. But the main thing was that it had downstairs it had 3 large spaces, and we have 3 departments: type foundry, composing room and press room, where the printing is done, and the hand book bindery. And upstairs, room for gallery and display spaces and for offices. And it was as though the building had been built for us. It was perfect.
So there's something in the numbers and the fundamental geometry of the building that just linked with your needs. I mean, one of the things I like too about your situation is that it was industrial and it was built for that purpose, and what you are doing is industrial. But at the same time that it's industrial, it's a high level of craftsmanship, artisanship, art. So I mean, that's part of the magic of printing in general, is that it is simultaneously an industry and an art. And to find a building where it all just clicks into place in a historic context. What do you, other people who have businesses in the Presidio, do you sort of know each other? Do you, is there back and forth?
Yes, the tenants of the Presidio do have things in common, but I think we're unusual in that we're making things. There are lots of offices that are devoted to doing good works, saving rainforests and so on, but we're using this industrial building for a purpose, and that's quite different from most of the rest of the tenants.
Something that came out, I think, pretty strongly in both Colin and Vic and Heather's presentations is this sense of community involvement, that you're doing this thing in this place, and the community. I mean, actually, it was very much in Colin's as well, particularly, where you're doing this thing, but it's based in the community, and the community is responding back and forth to it. I think that's rather magical. Any more thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would say, I mean, certainly when you're making a product, to be able to engage people in the process of making it, I think is a way to share with them the values that you have. So for us, it was always important to build not just a factory that would make a great product, but also a factory that would engage visitors so that they would ask questions and be drawn into why is the fermentation exposed to the air, or why are you using copper stills? To be able to, have to prompt questions in a way through the architecture, through the equipment that we have, was really a way to explain why we made a lot of the decisions, and ultimately why, the virtues of our product as opposed to something that comes from another distillery or something from Kentucky.
My conduit of contact to Vic and Heather was Julian Adams from the State Historic Preservation Office, because he goes to your place. And I get the sense, there's that guy who's the blogger, who also has podcasts on his website, and one of them is about you. I get the sense from all of those things that I don't want to sort of go so far as to call it a salon kind of thing that's going on, but there are people who are interested in what's happening architecturally and urbanistically in Troy who seem to hang out at your place.
Absolutely. And the interesting thing there now is that I think within the next year, we're going to see many other places opening up that are following that style. So it'll be interesting to see kind of the movement in Troy as that happens.
Is everything that all of you are doing it seems to me to be absolutely individual to the proprietors. What so often happens, particularly in big cities, is that old buildings end up getting used by large corporations or chains or people we all have, heard of. And sometimes they can do pretty wonderful stuff and it can be aesthetically distinguished, et cetera. But there's not a sense that it's owned by somebody and reflects their personality. And I think that that's one of the most wonderful things. And I think, frankly, at the moment, Justin sort of alluded to this, I think a lot of the controversy in preservation now is that so much of what happens with old buildings and old neighborhoods is global, as Justin said, or is corporate. And to find these one-off situations like you've created or gotten yourselves into, in some ways, to me, it feels like preservation going back to its roots. It's where preservation used to be before, as Fred said, it became so ingrained that the corporations got into it, and so there's a real almost gray market aspect to what you're doing.
That we place a lot of blame on the corporations, but I want to blame the customer. People need to be a little more discriminating about where they spend their money, and eating out in chain restaurants is irresponsible. Period. But what that leads to is every city in the United States beginning to look exactly the same. And, the people in this room, spread the word. Blame the customer. It's all their fault.
Let's open this to question and answer. Fred?
I don't feel funny being the first to ask you a question, but thank you. It seems to me, yes, okay, good. It seemed, I just hadn't thought of this until you all started talking, but the Presidio on the West Coast, a former military complex of some sort, and the Navy Yard on the East Coast, another former military installation of some sort, both lost their uses and both have recovered their uses now through a bunch of people seeking space as incubators in some cases and new ways of thinking about creativity. But it seems to me you're naturally a collection of accidental preservationists because almost none of you probably are there because of the old building per se, but it was available, it was cheap, and you're there, and you're a collection, you're a community. And Jason made a community out of a series of buildings. And same in Troy. I'm just wondering what you all might collectively think about other cities of your own than where you are, other cities that we know about, Detroit, Buffalo, other cities that are having trouble. Are there other big complexes that where this kind of activity can begin to be the beginning of a renovation?
I think Vic kind of alluded to it. I mean, you need something to be that catalyst, and in any area, if you've got 2 or 3 things that are going strong, that just starts to feed off of itself. And I think that's one of the reasons that the historic tax credit program is so important. It's not just the return on investment that you get by saving one building and having a company or a business or an organization reuse that building. It's all the residual benefit that you get by other people seeing that and being inspired to do the building next door to it, whether that they use federal or state programs to do it, or whether they use private financing and get it done that way. But I think just feeding off each other is something that's happened a lot in our area, and I don't know if that's the same in the like in the Presidio, but it's something that's definitely been a factor for us.
David Abramson had a question.
Yeah, there are different layers of preservation, bureaucracy, and regulation in these 4 different examples. Obviously, in the Navy Yard and the Presidio, it comes along with with that process. Vic and Heather said to the city, "Stay away from us. Just let us do our thing." Jason, you seem to just indicate now that you're using tax credits, so there's some layer of designation, regulation, particularly from you and from Vic and Heather. I'd like to understand, actually from Vic and Heather in particular, how the freedom from those requirements permitted you to do what you do, or more important, how, if they had been there, a regulatory construct, how it would have inhibited you. And then if Jason, that relates to you, I'd be certainly interested in hearing that too.
I think if any regulation held up that project on Broadway, that building probably would have collapsed. We were coming into this thing in the 9th inning and managed to pull it out somehow. And the government knew that. The only other interested parties in this parcel were looking to knock it down for parking. And probably the most qualified developer, masterful, in the upstate region is Sonny Bonaccio. And I saw him snooping around, gangsterish kind of name. He's a nice guy, really. And I was nervous because the backyard, it was infringing on our property of the wine bar. And I said, Sonny, if you're going to buy this building, please consider allowing us to utilize the backyard. It's like really important to us. Business is really good. We need to grow. He says, Vic, calm down. If you handed me that building and then handed me an envelope with $50,000 cash, I wouldn't take the deal, and no one's gonna. So in this particular situation, we sat down with the mayor and the deputy mayor, and we said, there's a chance that we may or may not be able to pull this off. We really didn't have a plan B, so we had to pull it off. But the only way it was gonna happen is if we just went in there and did what we needed to do.
And the only thing I would add to that is, Vic had mentioned, we said basically just leave us alone and let us do what we need to do. I think my take on that is sort of what he just hinted at there, which is a little bit more of a reciprocal relationship. So we were, in many ways, very communicative and proactively so and they worked with us to get the job done.
And following the completion of what we had thought the structural stabilization was, then at that point the government said everything that you've done needs to now be verified. And that process doubled our time, and we had to come back and undo a lot of things. But I think that kind of works. Get in there, patch it up, save it from falling down, and then let's work together with the local government to ensure basic stability. It worked well in our situation. Jason?
So we've used tax credits on a few of our projects. I think we've done 4 right now, and we have 2 or 3 others in the works. But we're very selective about which projects we use tax credits on. The whole Cherokee area is in a federal historic district, so all the projects that we're working on, almost all of them are eligible for tax credits. But we pick the ones where we're going to really kind of preserve the original design and look and feel of the building to use tax credits on. What's great about the historic tax credit program is that you're not required to abide by their standards unless you take their money. And it's really nice to be able to have that opportunity when you need it, especially for some of the ones that require more significant structural changes or repairs. One of the areas where we run into a lot of problems is with local preservation review districts. Those are set up with a great intent to obviously preserve the character of the buildings. But I've recently purchased 2 or 3 properties that are in a local preservation review district, and they have to go through cultural resources. And the amount of additional effort that puts on us is so incredible that I don't think we'll be doing any more projects in local preservation review districts. So in that respect, it's actually created a disincentive for developers to do that preservation work. And a lot of times, I mean, the buildings we're working on have been vacant for 15, 20 years. They wouldn't last too much longer before they are just beyond repair. And There's a lot of problems that go with that. I mean, there's very vague guidelines, especially when you're dealing with commercial storefronts, and the guidelines are sometimes written for residential. They're interpreted in wildly different ways, a lot of guesswork involved, especially if you don't have original photos of what the buildings looked like. And a lot of times the storefronts have been so adapted over time, it's like, which era do you pick to restore to? So I'm personally becoming not a fan of local preservation review districts, even though I'm a big fan of preservation. I think they kind of work contrary to their intent.
Well, government can only really stop things from happening, right? What are they? They're going to go out there and do it. They offer their opinions, and I've sat in rooms where we're talking about doors that we just purchased, and people there, absolutely not. No, what do you mean? And it's a matter of opinion. How do you determine whether a building that was built in 1874 should look like it's 1951 or 1890? It's illogical. And a lot of times they're not government employees with authority. They're people from the community who have a lot of feelings, and it becomes an emotional thing. And that's not what government should be about. Government should be about mechanics.
Right.
Yes.
I wanted to talk a little bit more about the community versus communities, plural communities, and whether these projects were contested. And you talked about which era you restored to. There's a lot of erasing of history that goes on, and maybe of present. So I wonder if there were any difficult moments, contestations with certain elements of the community, whether folks are happy about the directions that you're echoing in, or whether there's some grief over things that are also lost.
Well, maybe I'll just jump in, because I think one of the advantages of being in the Navy Yard or the Presidio is that you're not actually in a neighborhood, so people don't feel they have a huge, we kind of eliminated that emotional stake from whatever the work that we're doing. I mean, our business is, I don't know, it's vaguely smelly, and it's noisy at times, and it's just one of those things where we got to avoid the whole discussion of gentrification and all of that, because we're in a district that is zoned specifically for manufacturing. And so I think everybody across the board has felt like, wow, it's great that you're manufacturing instead of warehousing, which is what had mostly been going on in the Navy Yard before we moved in. So I think for our business as exclusively manufacturing, it's great that the city has supported this district, and it's secure, and they continue to invest in creating this district for manufacturing. And I think that's been very helpful to us as that type of business.
We're fortunate in the same way because we have molten lead, which is not dangerous, but if it had been a neighborhood decision.
Yeah, there was a certain amount of paranoia about that. We had to try to educate people that lead only becomes really dangerous if it's put up into the atmosphere and has to be heated to tremendously high temperatures in order to do that. And in the making of printing type, it's really not a hazard, except wash your hands before you eat, as your mother told you.
In 1970, Troy underwent urban renewal, but so they knocked down a pretty significant block, 4 sides of a block, but they had no plan to put anything there in its place. So they called it the Great Hole. It was there for a while. And then eventually, in the 80s, somebody put a horrendous-looking atrium there, glass monstrosity. And so the people that are longtime residents in Troy, they believe that the entire city, suffered an amazing loss. But the truth is that it's still, in many estimations, the most well-preserved city in New York State. So a lot of these people don't realize what they have. So the moment somebody's trying to preserve something, there's unanimous support across the board. And people really love their old buildings there, and they love what young people are doing with them.
That's kind of been
You had
our
a question?
experience as well,
Sorry.
too. I was just say echo those thoughts. I mean, while we are kind of pulling off some of that layered history, most of the layered history that we're undoing is like a rent-a-center that went in the 80s and lasted 20 or 30 years, or some of these businesses that didn't really have any contribution to or thought towards the aesthetic and their impact on the architectural component of the community.
Colin, I went to a birthday party last January, and I took a bottle of your bourbon, and I made a big hit. But I wanted to ask you, because I know you have a book that you wrote about this story, and I wondered if your efforts to use print and to kind of formalize communication about, this way of sort of bringing the history into the present, has that been like part of your intent? Is it something that happened spontaneously, and how has it shaped what's happened for your business and for the building?
Right. So the book that we wrote is called The Kings County Distillery Guide to Urban Moonshining, and it is on one side, it's a recipe to how to make whiskey if you want to make whiskey at home, otherwise known as moonshine. But I think it goes back to that question or the discussion earlier, which is that a lot of our businesses are just reflections of our personality, and the things that we become obsessed with through running the business. In my case, it became history. I wasn't really necessarily a historian, but I was interested in architecture and visual communication, and so and certainly history and telling that story. So all of that became, in a way, a different way to approach people, I guess. So we've sold as many bottles of whiskey as we have, and we sold as many books as we have sold bottles of whiskey, because the book is easier to make, and the whiskey's hard to make. So yeah.
What I would like to just conclude by saying is thank you all for being just as unusual as I hoped you would be. And thanks, everyone.